On the afternoon of December 20th, 1963, a cold winter silence enveloped Baltiyskaya Street in northern Moscow. Inside a modest residential apartment, a mother returned home from her shift to find her 12-year-old son, Konstantin Sobolev, lying motionless on the floor. The physical reality of the scene was devastatingly clear. The boy had been struck multiple times in the head with a sharp, heavy object, which forensic investigators later identified as a small, mass-produced tourist axe. When the Moscow militia arrived to secure the area and conduct a thorough inventory of the apartment, the potential motives for such violence became entirely confusing. The perpetrator had bypassed expensive household electronics, choosing instead to steal a highly specific, almost worthless collection of items: a cheap children's sweater, a bottle of low-grade cologne, beach sunglasses, and exactly 60 Soviet rubles. There were no signs of a forced entry. The door lock was completely intact, and the frame showed no damage. The killer had gained access to the apartment simply by knocking on the wooden door and uttering 2 words into the quiet hallway: Mosgaz. Open up. In the early 1960s, the Soviet Union was a society built on a foundation of absolute, conditioned trust in state infrastructure. Citizens routinely opened their doors to any individual asserting an official title, and utility workers from the state gas company, Mosgaz, regularly conducted unannounced safety inspections. By using this simple identity, a predator had turned a routine administrative task into a skeleton key that could open virtually any home in the capital. The Moscow militia immediately recognized that they were facing an unprecedented threat: a cold, calculated opportunist who was systematically exploiting the social contract to hunt human beings inside their own sanctuaries. He hid in plain sight, moving through the concrete mazes of Moscow's rapid post-war housing boom, blending into the sea of grey winter coats, entirely invisible, because no one expected a monster to knock politely and announce a state service. At this stage of the early spree, the killer possessed absolutely no forensic footprint. In the mid-1960s, the Soviet law enforcement apparatus lacked a national centralized fingerprint database, and there was zero historical precedent or profiling methodology for a serial killer within the borders of the USSR. Operating with total freedom from institutional suspicion, his early crimes targeted the most defenseless. Just 5 days after his first strike, on the morning of December 25th, 1963, the perpetrator targeted a residential building on Ivanov Street. He chose the mid-morning hours, a period when the surrounding neighborhood was largely empty of adult residents who were away working at state factories. This time, his knock was answered by 74-year-old Maria Ermilova. Following his established routine, he announced a routine gas check and walked past her into the apartment. As the elderly woman turned her back to lead the supposed inspector toward the kitchen pipes, the killer struck her from behind with the tourist hatchet. He then began a rapid search of the rooms, stepping into a rear bedroom where he discovered the woman's 9-year-old grandson, Valentin, who was playing quietly by himself. To ensure that no living witness could describe his face to the authorities, the killer attacked the child directly in his bed. The logistical sequence was cold and efficient, leaving 2 bodies in a dark apartment for a pathetic haul of plunder: a simple silver pocket watch and a small metal flashlight. The killer pocketed the items, wiped the steel blade of his axe, and walked out of the building unnoticed. The investigation into these horrific crimes received its most chilling and detailed breakthrough from a highly unusual series of encounters involving a young boy named Volodya Teplov, who lived on the very same street. Volodya was home alone when a heavy knock rattled his door, followed by a man announcing himself as a Mosgaz inspector, conducting a mandatory gas pressure check. Hearing the official title, Volodya turned the latch and let the man inside. The stranger walked into the kitchen, turned the stove valves, and visually scanned the apartment, looking for signs of wealth or other occupants. Satisfied, the man told the boy that the inspection was complete, but that he needed to check a main valve downstairs, and he promptly left. A short time later, the same man knocked again. Volodya opened the door a second time. The inspector claimed he needed to re-verify the kitchen readings because of a pressure drop in the building line. He entered, repeated his superficial movements, and left once more. The reason the killer did not strike Volodya during these first two entries came down to pure logistical caution. A serial opportunist required total tactical control. He needed to be absolutely certain the boy was completely alone in the apartment, and that no neighbors or parents were about to walk through the front door while he was executing the crime. He was scouting the layout and testing the boy's isolation, when the exact same man knocked on the door for a third time within a matter of hours, asserting yet another excuse about a final administrative signature. Volodya's survival instinct took over. Sensing a deep, unexplainable danger in the man's unnatural persistence, the boy refused to turn the latch. He spoke firmly through the closed wooden door, stating that his parents were away and that he was strictly forbidden from letting anyone inside again. The stranger's polite demeanor instantly dissolved. He stood outside in the dark corridor for several minutes, knocking loudly and insistently demanding entry, trying to manipulate and command the child into compliance. Volodya stood his ground, in absolute silence, backing away from the door, until the heavy footsteps finally retreated down the concrete stairwell. When the militia later swept the neighborhood looking for witnesses, Volodya provided detectives with an exceptionally detailed description of the man's face, having studied him closely during those first two successful entries. More importantly, he noted a specific anomaly about the stranger's winter attire. The man was wearing a traditional Soviet ushanka fur hat, but instead of tying the thick ear flaps securely on top of his head, as was the universal fashion in Moscow, he had tied them together at the very back of his neck. To a seasoned detective, this single logistical detail proved that the killer was an outsider, a recent transplant from the warmer southern republics, who did not understand the winter etiquette of the capital. The predator's insatiable confidence drove him out of Moscow and into the surrounding regions as the hunt intensified. On December 27, 1963, he arrived in the city of Ivanovo, searching for a completely unmonitored environment. He walked down Kalinin Street, knocked on a door, and introduced himself as a municipal utility worker. The door was opened by 15-year-old Galina Petrov-Pavlovskaya. Once inside the apartment, the clinical, transactional nature of his earlier robberies dissolved into a far more chaotic and depraved assault. He turned on the young girl, subjecting her to a brutal sexual assault. Following the assault, he struck her 9 times in the head with his tourist hatchet, leaving her for dead on the floor. He ransacked the home, stealing a knitted sweater, a cardigan, a down shawl, and 90 rubles. However, he made a major tactical mistake. Despite suffering catastrophic head injuries, Galina possessed a powerful physical resilience. She survived the attack, regained consciousness, and became one of the most critical living witnesses for the state, providing the regional militia with an exact face-to-face confirmation of the stranger's appearance, and reinforcing the description of the outsider with the incorrectly tied Ushanka hat. He returned to the capital, but his mechanical routine soon suffered another major tactical failure. On December 28, 1963, he navigated toward a large, prestigious residential building on Leningradsky Prospect, a bustling avenue in the heart of Moscow. He knocked on the door of a young woman named Larisa Kuptsova, repeating his standard utility ruse. When Kuptsova opened the door, the man stepped across the threshold and immediately pulled the hatchet from beneath his heavy winter coat. However, Kuptsova did not freeze or succumb to the psychological paralysis that had claimed his previous victims. Instead, she initiated a desperate, violent struggle for her life. She began screaming at the top of her lungs to alert the neighbors across the hall, and reached out, grabbing the sharp steel blade of the axe with her bare hands to prevent it from striking her head. The unexpected physical resistance and the echoing noise in the stairwell completely panicked the attacker. Fearing that the building residents would trap him in the corridor, the killer abandoned his attempt to ransack the home, struck Kuptsova one final time to break her grip, and fled down the concrete stairs into the winter fog. Kuptsova survived the encounter, giving the Moscow militia a second verified, face-to-face confirmation of the suspect's identity, proving that the entity known as Mosgaz was a flesh-and-blood criminal who could be resisted and caught. The final, most destructive phase of his spree took place in the first week of January 1964. On January 8th, he entered a residential flat on Sheremetiyevskaya Street in the Marina Roshcha district. The apartment belonged to a 46-year-old woman named Maria Ermakova. Though this time, he presented himself as an employee from the local housing office. Once inside, he abandoned all restraint, inflicting roughly 20 blows with his tourist hatchet to silence her permanently. While searching the premises, the haul was initially small: 5 skeins of yarn, 3 pairs of socks, a wallet containing 30 rubles, and a desktop clock. But then, he decided to take a heavy, valuable object, a massive luxury Start 3 television set. This stolen television would ultimately become his fatal undoing. Realizing that the sheer weight and size of the television made it impossible to transport through the snowy streets on foot without attracting suspicion, the killer walked outside and hired a random private truck driver, paying him to haul the massive electronic unit across the city. He didn't take it to a black market fence. Instead, he delivered it straight to the apartment of his unsuspecting mistress, a young local ballerina. Days later, when the Moscow militia flooded the city with descriptions of the stolen items, the truck driver recognized the specific model of the television he had transported. He walked into the militia headquarters and gave detectives the exact address of the apartment where he had delivered the heavy unit. When investigators raided the flat, they found the stolen television sitting in the room. The ballerina, horrified to learn the truth, revealed that her boyfriend had suddenly booked a train ticket to the city of Kazan to flee the capital. The man behind the tourist axe was Vladimir Ionesyan, a 26-year-old native of Tbilisi, Georgia. Ionesyan was not a hardened criminal from the Soviet Gulag system. He was an educated, highly articulate former opera singer. He possessed a powerful, melodic voice and a refined demeanor. But he was driven by a toxic, blinding obsession with his young ballerina mistress, Alevtina Dmitrieva. to maintain the grand illusion that he was a high-ranking KGB official and a wealthy state artist. Ionesyan had turned to these brutal, small-scale apartment robberies, using the blood-soaked rubles and stolen goods to fund a lavish lifestyle for her. His double life met a swift, clinical end. On January 12, 1964, plainclothes detectives spotted him on the crowded platform of the Kazan railway station. He was wearing his heavy winter coat, with the ear flaps of his Ushanka hat tied tightly at the back of his neck. The arrest was bloodless and instant. 4 officers pinned him to the concrete platform before he could realize he was compromised. The Soviet legal system moved with unprecedented velocity. Evaluated by state psychiatrists, Ionesyan was declared entirely sane, motivated not by madness, but by a cold, narcissistic willingness to trade human lives for superficial luxury. On January 30th, 1964, Vladimir Ionesyan was found guilty of multiple counts of capital murder and sentenced to death. Just 48 hours later, on February 1st, he was taken into the deep basement of the Butyrka prison and executed by a firing squad, bringing a permanent, silent, close to the reign of the capital's first official monster.